And I want to follow up with you on some of the issues around water and agriculture. We heard it mentioned a few times this morning, and I'm going to provide just a little more detail and some of my thoughts on where we see ourselves going in the future. So a number of years ago, even before the start of the 21st century, there was a number of us making predictions at that point that were saying water, not oil, will define many of the global decisions in the 21st century, and water will be the major influence on the world's food supply as we go into the future. Well, here we are 16 years later, and we're already seeing some of these issues around oil starting to play themselves out. Whether or not that's in the long term, but I think when we look at 40, 50 years down the road, we're certainly going to see that a need for some other options beside fossil fuels as we move forward in the economic development. So I think agriculture is going to be a major potential driver, not only for Alberta, but for Canada and many of the other countries in the world where water is available. And it doesn't mean that water is tremendously available, but something that we can manage and take advantage of. And one of the key reasons for that is the need for additional food supplies as we go into the future. And this is only a 35-year projection, taking us up to about 2050. Beyond that, I have not seen very good numbers at this point, but the suggestion was that we may need to see a doubling of food supplies in that next 35 years. One of the obvious reasons is population growth. We're about 7 billion. We'll be up to about 9.3 billion by 2050. But that's more of a linear increase. And to my mind, the two larger issues around that, and we heard that a bit this morning, is the caloric intake by individuals, particularly in many of the developing countries where economies are starting to improve significantly. India and China are two good examples. Between the two of them, well over 2 billion people that are starting to see a growing middle class and money to purchase more and more food supplies. And a significant indicator also is the shift in our diets from more of a grain, particularly again in the developing countries, from more of a grain-based diet to additional meat supplies in their diet. And again, this is a direct relationship to the economic development of many of these countries. So when we look then at the changes in terms of the percent of animal source foods in diets, you can see dramatic change in China. If you go all the way down, you can see how those changes are being impacted. And this is only up to 2007, 2009, and we're continuing to see that change as we go forward. If you look at the US and Canada, and this is the data from the US here, we're actually looking at a shrinking in terms of the amount of meat in the food diet, but the developing countries are certainly looking at that more and more. And there's implications to that in our agricultural production. When we look at converting our grain production into meat, there's for chicken 3 kilograms of grain equivalents and 4 times the volume of water required. Moving down to cattle, 8 kilograms of grain equivalents and 10 times the volume of water. So there's significant implications on not only the land side of things, but certainly in our water supply and water management. Hogs are somewhere in between chickens and the beef side. Biofuel production, we talked a little bit about that. There's significant grain production and other production that goes into the biofuel. When we look at only a few years from now, we're seeing up to 12% of the world's coarse grains production going into biofuel production, 28% of the sugar cane, 14% of the world's vegetable production. And beyond that, we don't have, or I have not seen any real information for that. So that is going to have an impact also on how much food is being supplied by both the land and the water. Long-term ability then to feed the world's growing population is going to depend on many factors, but certainly in terms of the natural resource side, an ever-shrinking land base, and an increased competition for available water supplies. And I would say of those two issues that we're looking at, water is going to be the dominant issue that we're going to be facing in not only in the future, but even today we're starting to see some of those shifts taking place. So I want to talk about that then in terms of where we're at currently and where we're likely to be in the future. And even today, for much of the world, particularly in many of the developing countries, access to even a reasonable amount of good quality water is a constant challenge. And we're seeing that challenge grow in many of the countries, and certainly the ones that I've been working in. Currently, about 60% of the world's food is produced on rain-fed or dryland agricultural lands. And based on current technologies, we don't see a significant increase in our ability to produce more production from those dryland or rain-fed agriculture areas. Water productivity in those areas tends to be low. The evaporation loss is high, particularly in the southern areas. Crops frequently dry because of drought conditions. When we think of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in particular, that's where the productivity numbers are very low. Ethiopia is an example that I'll use, and I was just working in there, in fact, in February and March, and of course they're in the middle of one of their significant drought conditions that occur all too frequently in that country. There are ongoing issues of food insecurity in many of these countries. Irrigation at this time makes up about 19% of the world's agricultural land base, but produces about 40% or more of the world's current food supply. Many of the developing countries that I've talked about are totally or very dependent on irrigated crop production for their food supply. And it is projected that up to 80% of the additional food required to feed the growing population is going to come from irrigation as we go into the future. But there's some real concerns and problems with irrigation on a world basis. Low water use efficiency, soil salinity, waterlogging problems are significant, and it's been suggested up to 40% of the irrigated lands in the world are impacted to some degree by these issues. And I think more importantly than that, we have the technology to resolve some of those issues about efficiency and soil salinity, but many of the countries are facing acute water shortages that depend on irrigation development. There's a number of these maps that have been produced. This is the one from the International Water Management Institute that looks at projected water scarcity by 2025, which is only a relatively few years from now. The areas in kind of the salmon or orange color there are what we consider physical water scarcity, where there simply is not enough water in the system to provide sufficient water for domestic and industrial and agricultural development programs. Economic water scarcity means that there is water, but the cost of developing it is prohibitive for many of those countries. And if you look at South America and Sub-Saharan Africa are two examples where there is water supplies, but the cost is very, very high to develop. And then you would look at some of the northern hemisphere countries, such as the US and Canada, that in general have little or no water scarcity as a whole. And we know that regionally, that isn't exactly accurate. But I think the important part is that many countries are going to be forced to abandon their policy of food self-sufficiency because of water shortages, and particularly those areas that we see in the orange color where there's physical water supply shortages already. So what is the potential then for many of these the developing countries? I want to just focus a little bit on Sub-Saharan Africa, because that's where I have some experience, and some of the real issues are taking place now. Most of these countries that I've identified there along the eastern and southern side are impacted by the current drought situation that is going through that area. And their crop production and livestock production is severely impacted. I'm sure you've seen just in the last few days some of the pictures coming from some of those areas. But it is interesting that it is recognized that agricultural development is key to reducing poverty in those areas. Irrigation can increase agricultural production by 50%. There's a cost of 40 billion, but when you think about that on a global basis and how much money actually goes into different wars and regional war situations, it is a small amount of money to help many of these countries in that area develop. And farmer participation and time are critical requirements for that. It's not something that you're going to do overnight. If we look at Ethiopia as an example, and when I have been working there for the last 10 or 12 years, I've seen significant changes in that country, even in that short period of time. And what we're starting to see now, whether you agree with it or not, the Ethiopian government has recognized the need to develop hydroelectric and irrigation dams and reservoirs on the Nile and tributary river systems. They have a very intensive program to do that. The dam down in the left-hand side there is the Grand Renaissance Dam that is not yet complete, but will be in the next couple of years, and will be the largest in Africa. Interesting, most of the rural people in Ethiopia do not have access to electricity, but even with the significant production of that dam, at least 50% of the production, of the electrical production from that dam will be sold to their neighboring countries. Because the other thing that countries like Ethiopia are sadly lacking is foreign currency to purchase many of the products and supplies that they need. The Chinese government is working very closely with the Ethiopian government in many of these kinds of program areas. But they're also recognizing a need to upgrade and develop new irrigation projects, and that's some of the work that I'm doing with them, and programs to increase knowledge and capacity of irrigation farmers, because you can't take a rain-fed or a dryland farmer, you can't in Canada and the US, and you can't in these countries, and immediately make them experts in irrigation development. That also takes time and a lot of capacity development. But the government has recognized that food security is a key priority for them, and are starting to move forward with support from the World Bank and the Asian Development, African Development Bank, as well as the Chinese government. So where does Canada fit when we're looking at some of these global areas? Well, it has been recognized, or at least identified, that there's really only about 5 countries in the world right now that have the potential to significantly increase food production. And this list was done a little while ago. I think there might be a few question marks around Brazil at this point, because some of the key issues in terms of sufficient land and water, suitable climate, reliable infrastructure, and efficient commercial and financial services, there may be some questions around, but this is a long-term view that when we're looking at that. And Canada is obviously one of the key countries that has been identified as being able to meet some of these growing world food demands. And we have the opportunity to be a much larger player in this area, and I specifically use the word opportunity because, as you'll see at the bottom, converting that opportunity requires, there's some reality challenges for us to consider as we move forward. The one question would be, do we even want to go down that road? And we heard a bit of that discussion this morning, and I think it's a very good debate for us to have as we go forward. Personally, I think we have a role to play, and I think there's a moral obligation in my mind as part of the world community to move in that direction. And if we roll that down just a little more and look at Alberta then, in terms of that, we are certainly part of that opportunity. And when we look at Canada, we have a large agricultural land base, even at this point, a small population base, which is to our advantage, a very strong rain-fed agriculture industry, and what I've called a world-class irrigation industry, somewhere around 700,000 hectares of irrigation right now, most of it in southern Alberta, but we see it spread throughout the province, which represents about 70% of Canada's total. The real advantage that I see there is having that partnership between rain-fed and irrigation provides many opportunities for us as a province that many of the other provinces don't have, and perhaps won't have as we move into the future. So I'm only going to have a couple of slides on the irrigation side, but we've seen a lot of change in this industry in the last 100 or 110 years since irrigation really developed. And one of the areas when we look at is the use of water, and water use efficiency then has changed dramatically since 1965 and what we can see ourselves moving to in the future. When we look at the world average irrigation efficiency of around 43%, you can see where there's some real growth potential in many of those areas, but where Alberta is sitting relative to that. And we were just talking at lunch over at the tables, and right now we have about 8,000 kilometers of canals that supply water to our irrigation system. More than 50% of that is now in pipelines, and that is having a significant positive impact in terms of our irrigation efficiency. But much of that is because of what farmers are doing on the farm and the technologies that they're adopting. We just completed an economic impact study for irrigation in the province, and it has some quite significant numbers that are coming through there. And I won't go through all of this in detail, but the middle one, 4.7% of Alberta's cultivated land base generated 19% of the total provincial agricultural sales. So it goes in that same range when we talk about 19% of the total land base in the world is irrigation, but produces 40% of the food supply. It has a dramatic impact. And then the last one, when we look at the productivity of irrigated land relative to rain-fed, when you factor in all of the issues around that, about 7 times greater at this point in time. The industry contributed about 20% of the total provincial agri-food sector GDP, and every cubic meter of water delivered for irrigation and other related uses with that infrastructure generated about $3 to the provincial GDP and $2 in labor income. Interestingly enough, about 90% of the benefits accrued to the region and the province, and some even to the country as a whole, and only 10% to irrigation producers, because there has been a lot of discussion about whether public money should be going into irrigation infrastructure or water supply infrastructure. And I would say that at least this identifies, and this confirms some earlier studies that we were also looking at. But when we think about then the future opportunities of where we go with this, understanding that there are opportunities, there's also going to be challenges. What direction do we need to look at going? Well, when we look at climate change, and there's been some good discussion on that, and I'm sure there's going to be some more, one thing that farmers understand, that climate change has always been a reality in the farming life for since it took place, and certainly over the last 100 years. We're already seeing significant changes in the crops that we're growing because of warmer, longer growing seasons, warmer days and nights, and obviously hybrid development and many of the other genetic improvements that we're seeing on the land base. So there is a projection, and this is Alberta Agriculture's website, projected temperature increase of 3 to 5 degrees by 2050. And of course, regionally that's going to be a little different, but these are broad-based numbers. Interesting on the precipitation, by 2080, it is suggested that precipitation may in fact increase up to 15%. What it doesn't go into detail is, unfortunately, some of that precipitation increase may be in the winter months and not in the summer months. So there's going to be, it's not quite so simple to try and deal with that. And growing season, when we think about Edmonton and Grand Prairie, Fort McMurray, may be looking at, in the future, of similar growing conditions as we're seeing in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat today. So it gives you a bit of a concept then of what we might be looking at as we go into the future. So there is an opportunity, and this is a map that was produced by Klein in 2007 that looked at the impact of carbon dioxide increases as a result of climate change and the overall world impact on our ability to produce food. And you can see again in the northern hemispheres, including Canada, we're probably going to see significant increased production as a result of the growing degree days, but also in terms of increased carbon dioxide. What is concerning is when you look at many of the countries in the southern hemisphere, at least from this projection, there's going to be significant negative impacts as we go into particularly closer to the equator systems. As I mentioned, we're already seeing some of the increased crop diversification, particularly in irrigation at this point. More and more both silage and grain corn is now being grown, and we would project that is going to significantly increase in the future, if the dollars and the profit warrants it, but certainly that looks to be as high potential right now. But we're also going to see increased yields of existing crops such as alfalfa and some of the other forage crops. We may be seeing up to 7 or 8 cuts of alfalfa under irrigation in southern Alberta, as opposed to 3 cuts of alfalfa that we're currently looking at. In terms of opportunities, I've talked about some of the market changes, but I think when we look at future food demand is going to focus on meat and meat products. Certainly when we think about Canada and Alberta, processed foods are going to be in high demand. Higher quality food products, as the growing economies are starting to demand better and better food, and environmentally sustainable food products, I think are some of the issues that we want to look at. Alberta is well positioned, as is Canada, to take advantage of that. Food processing, demand is going to increase for that. The last issue, though, I think, is attracting new agri-food processing industries to Alberta must be a priority. We cannot continue to be simply exporters of our raw products without processing them here, and somehow we need to, with the water and the infrastructure and the entrepreneurial farmers that we have, we should be able to attract more and more of that processing side to here. But there are going to be some challenges, and I've focused on the South Saskatchewan River Basin in terms of we're likely going to see less water in our river systems during the summer period of time, and that is going to provide some challenges. What I've identified in here is that we need to have more focus, particularly in the irrigation area, not be concerned about expansion of irrigation, focus on intensifying and managing what we have as opposed to looking for more. More drought conditions are likely to be in place, although that's really unclear. But in terms of future, we are going to have to look at long-term drought strategies, not only for irrigation, but in terms of dry land and for all water users in the province. And that may need at least study of additional storage capacity, not just here, but in some of our river systems further north, including the North Saskatchewan, the Athabasca, and others. So how do we take advantage of that as we move forward? Well, I'm suggesting that Alberta and Canada is not well positioned at this point to take advantage of these, because our livestock, cropping, processing, and marketing sectors are not well integrated. They tend to work on a competitive basis with each other as opposed to getting together and working together. Provincially, regionally, and nationally, other countries that are being successful, New Zealand, Australia, of getting into those Asian markets, are doing that on a countrywide basis, and that is the second point that I'm looking at here. If we're going to market brand, we need to do it as a country, not as individual regions and not as provinces. Somehow we need to be working together much better than we are now. We talked about the example this morning of even the pipeline and the oil and gas side of things. We're so competitive as provinces and regions in the country. Somehow we're going to have to change that if we're going to really get into China in a big way, and India and Southeast Asia. From research to action, what I've identified here is that successful farmers are looking for opportunities to diversify and grow. They are subject to masses of research data that often conflicts with each other. Somehow that data needs to be combined into something useful that farmers can confidently implement. And lastly, marketing, environmental sustainability. This is an area that I think we have not developed nearly as well as we can. We have some great opportunities. Brad talked about that a little bit this morning. I think we're making some great strides in that, but we need to do a better job and market it as we go forward as one of those niches that I think are going to be in high demand as we go forward into the future. I think the opportunities for agriculture diversification and development and its impact on the Canadian as well as the Alberta economy are huge, but it is not going to come without a lot of hard work and commitment. Thank you very much.